Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jean-Marc Banabella, and this is Nick Kuipers. And today we will be presenting on Richard Rolle, the Hermit, the Mystic, the author. Richard Rolle was born in 1301 at Tortendale and died in 1349 at a nunnery in Hampole, probably due to the plague. Most of the information on his life is acquired from the Officium et Miracula, which was compiled after his death with the aim of canonization. The text places great emphasis on Rolle's oeuvres, and many details in the biography are confirmed in his works. For that reason, scholars assume that the Officium et Miracula has a valid core when it comes to Rolle's life. At the age of 18, Rolle left Oxford University without completing his studies, and after a conversion experience, he withdrew to the solitude of nature and became a hermit. As a hermit, he followed the framework of eremitism as prescribed in the Regula Hermitarum for English and continental hermits and anchorites. His original qualities came from his highly developed subjectivity, which came from his extensive knowledge on theology and Christian spirituality. Rolle did not accept any patronage from a bishop because he had a total commitment to freedom and was unwilling to submit to any form of authority that was not God. Also, he was consistent in his opinion that the hermit's life is especially suitable for mystical contemplation. Richard Rolle was a mystic, and his mystical experiences came mostly in the form of auditive visions, as we will learn from this quote. 2 years after his conversion, he had his key mystical experience, a visionary gaze through the open door of heaven to seek the beloved of his soul, so that the two might enter into union. Almost a year later, he experienced the intensity of God's love while meditating in a chapel as blissful, intense fire. Singing psalms, 9 months later in the same chapel, he received for the first time the gift of mystical melus or canor, an unearthly spiritual experience of sound with ineffably sweet harmony. In prayer directly afterwards, he felt this music within himself. It continued without interruption, and he sought to attune his thinking and meditating to it. End quote. Intense fire or burning love is one of the main features of Rolle's mysticism. One of his most popular works is even dedicated to this form of mystical experience. Also, the same is also true for Canor, which is actually his most distinctive feature as a mystic. Rolle actually had the desire to join the Order of the Seraphim, so God's choir, after he died. And also, from this quote, it is clear that Rolle was a true mystic, since he tries to attune his thinking, like an antenna, to the divine, to receive visions and sounds from God and experience unio. As an author, he wrote many mystical works, both in Latin and in English. And many of his Latin works were composed in order to continue with the great tradition of mystical writing. However, Rolle actually felt an urge to preach, but could not since he was not ordained a priest. So instead, he composed sermons to be read in the special guise of treatises, for which he gained legitimizing authority. In this way, he could fulfill his obligation of serving his neighbor without undermining his own contemplative life, vita contemplativa. Although women were also addressed in Rolle's Latin works, his vernacular writings were specifically addressed to a female audience. And lastly, Rolle was criticized for self-sanctifying himself, especially in his earlier works. This is so because it went against humility. Furthermore, his works were usually divided in threes, just like his mystical experiences and his definitions for divine love. The divisions must be regarded as degrees, each time getting closer to unio. For instance, Rolle divided the development of the mystical soul as beginning with lictio, then moving to oratio, and then to contemplatio. His mystical experiences were usually divided as beginning with calor, then to dulcor, and then finishing with canor. And lastly, the definitions and degrees of divine love are divided as beginning with amor insuperabilis, then amor inseparabilis, and then last amor singularis. Now Nick will continue with more information on the tripartite division of Roll's mysticism.
The first tripartite structure that Roll describes consistently is that of the development of the mystical soul. To become a mystic, there are different gradations of ways to develop your mystical abilities. To begin your work as a mystic, you must perform lectio, reading in particular the effective biblical texts, which is the first action that is fairly easy to achieve. Roll then describes oratio, praying, as the action to move into contemplatio. Roll suggests that to truly embody the mystical experience, contemplatio or meditatio is the key, the moments in which you initiate entering the song or canor, where mystical experiences are possible. Roll also mentions purgatio, penance, as an integral part of moving towards the mystical experience. The development of the mystical soul is mostly described in Emendatio Vitae. The second tripartite structure involves the mystical experiences themselves. There are 3 different levels of ascendance. At first, a mystic shall sense the fire of love, calor, meaning to feel a warmth within the presence of God. Secondly, the mystic ascends to dulcor, reaching an ineffable bliss that is felt but not grasped. Every level of ascendance is more difficult to achieve, and to reach canor, the song, a rhapsodic, ecstatic state, is the ultimate achievement and the state in which a mystic is most closely in communion with God. The concepts of calor, dulcor, and canor are described in many of his works, 2 of which being Incendium Amoris, the fire of love, and Melos Amoris. The third tripartite structure is the definitions of love. Wolfgang describes these definitions quite perfectly. The first definition of love, known as amor insuperabilis, cannot be surpassed by any other stirring of the will. It wards off every temptation and knows only the fear of injuring or angering God. One may speak of the second degree of love, amor inseparabilis, when heart, soul, and spirit are directed entirely towards Jesus, especially toward his name. Finally, amor singularis is experienced when all joy and consolation come only from God, through incandescent love that is as strong as death, when the loving one wants only what God wants and is prepared to suffer for him. And through this love all thought is transposed into music, which is the canor that Richard Rolle often describes, to feel among the angels. Rolle became such a well-known mystic that female mysticism would be inspired by him for many years to come. The Ancrena Wissa preceded Rolle and was part of Rolle's inspiration. Rolle himself would put more emphasis on the passions as a subject for female mystics to focus on. He would write some of his later works to Margaret Kirkby, a nun of Hampole. He included 2 love poems in his work, Form of Living, just for her. Those, for example, inspired by him are names we all know by now, such as Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp. Thank you for listening.